On now. I haven't got a clapper board, I'm afraid.
Okay, good evening, everyone, and welcome. I'm Jimmy Burns, Chairman of the British Spanish Society, and it's great to see you all coming in from various parts in Spain and the UK. This is the latest in our webinar series, and it's a very relevant subject. We've been covering contemporary political and historical issues affecting Spain and the UK over our webinar series, and it's great to have these two top panelists to discuss a subject of key relevance for understanding of the UK in modern times and how its relations with others, not least Spain, might pan out in the months and years ahead. I would like to welcome, first of all, my former colleague at the FT, Philip Stevens, an award-winning journalist with previous books to his name, including a very good biography of Tony Blair, chief political commentator of the FT, and whose new book, Britain Alone, The Path from Suez to Brexit, is the title of this webinar. When we worked together at the FT over many years, we used to share the same corridor and have several discussions. I always remember Philip as an incredibly incisive and courageous columnist, and he was particularly courageous in taking on official propaganda and going against the flow. So it's great to having him here tonight. 2 months on from Brexit, we're all still struggling with COVID. We're also beginning to struggle a little bit with the consequences of Brexit. It's still early days, but it's probably good to bring it back up front. This book, Britain Alone, which I strongly recommend because it's a very easy read. It's a real page turner, but also incredibly incisive in terms of historical record and political analysis, is a polemic. It's an attempt to put recent events into the broader context of Britain's often tortured search for its place in the world since 1945, a story of exalted ambition and straitened circumstances. As Philip puts early on, Brexit strikes a pose, a belief that Britain can take to the seas and go it alone. The truth, according to Philip, is that Britain never did run the world. And as for Boris Johnson summing up something called Global Britain, this is merely, in his words, throwing a rhetorical cloak over a cacophony of often contradictory ideas. His book sets out to explain how the English are masters of self-deception, although not without redeeming qualities, which he might mention, and are in danger of being lost under a prime minister without a compass. Agree or disagree? I can think of few Spanish commentators more qualified to engage with Philip on this latest book than the prize-winning columnist and academic José Ignacio Torreblanca, also author of several books. He's the head of the Madrid office of the European Council on Foreign Relations, and among his 3 books is Who Governs in Europe, and aptly titled The Fragmentation of European Power. So I will now hand over to José Ignacio to engage with Philip. Enjoy yourselves. Over to you, Ignacio.
Okay, thank you so much. It's a pleasure to be here. So many good friends from the British Spanish Society, and also with Philip, who's, whom I enjoy so much. It's a pity. Last time we met in Malaga, which looks as much better than Zoom. But let's hope that we can resume these conversations very soon also, and that you have a chance to have your book translated and presented in Spain and in Spanish. So very much hoping very much for that. So Philippe, you will start now, right, with a comment, or you wanted to go right away?
It's up to you. I think Jimmy actually sort of set out what I'm trying to do in the book, which is really to set Brexit in a longer historical context, and to set the decision for us to sort of cast ourselves off in terms of this, as Jimmy said, this tortured search for a role. And I start with the Second World War, and we come out of that thinking we've won, but discover quite quickly that actually we did win, but we also lost, and that we're bankrupt, that the USA and the USSR are the dominant powers in the world, and our empire is beginning to disintegrate. And from then on, we have in Britain, it's very much an English thing, but I'll talk about it as Britain, the UK, have been sort of struggling to use a phrase once used by Douglas Hurd, the former Foreign Secretary, to punch above our weight in the world, to pretend to be rather more of a great power than we are. And I start the book with a quotation from a Whitehall official who warned of the dangers of this as long ago as 1949. And this chap he'd been chief scientific advisor to Winston Churchill during the war, and he said, reflecting on Britain in 1949, he said, look, we in Britain were a great nation, but we're no longer a great power. And as long as we pretend we are still a great power, we're in danger of ceasing to become a great nation. And I think that's been the struggle for Britain. And we've tried various things with our so-called special relationship with the United States, with membership of the EU, and now back to what in Boris Johnson's mind seems to be a second Elizabethan age, where we're going to rush off and conquer the world again. It's fantasy island stuff.
Yeah. So thanks for this. Thanks for the book. It's also with me here. I enjoyed it a lot. I can only say just good things. I'm recommending to everyone. I think it's an incredible read. It's very comprehensive. It reads like a thriller sometimes. I think there is a, as if the end was not known, but it's still, you want to continue reading. So, and there are two reasons in particular why I love the book. Is one, it has a subtext for a Spaniard. There are some things which are in common with Spain in terms of soul searching after empire and this constant struggle to think about who we are, having having an Atlantic life and past and friends and inspiration, culture, but at the same time, Europe being always half in, half out, question from within, from the outside. I think, this very troubled relationship with Europe and so on. Also in terms of states containing different nations with different aspirations at some point, that the glue of all these being sometimes very thin, and as in Britain, we can discuss that, as in Spain, sometimes you have the feeling that Europe is the only glue, bringing together the different nations, because it's the only structure of incentives that allows us to keep together and so on. So maybe this is why Brexit is so destabilizing. So that's also in common. And then finally, that both our countries were hit very heavily by a wave of populism around the same years, and I think it brings me memory to, I took my job as op-ed editor of El País at the moment of the Scottish referendum. Then it was the Brexit referendum. Then it was Trump. Then it's like kind of all democracies committing suicide, one like the other, like lemmings, because you're just moving to the precipice and so on. And in a sense, and this is where I wanted to get it started, is like Britain, it seems to me like ground zero of populism, because at the end, we got rid of Trump. Other guys, you can just challenge them at the polls and more or less, get rid of them. But, the lasting damage of Brexit, it's so irreversible, it's so lasting, it's so difficult to, of course, to undo, and it's a tragedy in a sense that, as you say in your book, it is as if nothing had been learned from Suez. It's like you go back circle in the book, and I guess this is very depressing in a sense, but this is what you're aiming at, right? Like to draw this circle, right?
This is the most depressing. I agree very much with the analogies you draw between Spain and Britain in terms of, looking west at looking, looking to the Americas and looking across the Atlantic, and then looking back to Europe and feeling global as well as European. Although Spain, I think, has adjusted much better than the UK. But for me, the sort of tragedy of this is that, we had this period after the war until Suez for about 10 years or so, where we sort of pretended that we could still be a great power. And this word that Churchill used to use, this phrase, we're one of the big three. And we used to pride ourselves that we'd have summits with, it'd be us, the Americans, and the Soviet Union. And Suez exploded that. I mean, the fact that the Americans basically just told us to give up and actually threatened to bring down sterling and the financial system if we didn't, exploded that myth. And we, for a few years, we sort of thought, well, okay, we'll just have to be special friends with the Americans, the special relationships. And Harold Macmillan, the then Prime Minister, had coined this phrase during the war of, playing Greeks to America's Rome. But this wasn't a satisfactory position. And there was a famous speech that the American statesman Dean Acheson gave in 1962, in which he criticized Britain as a nation that had lost an empire and failed to find a role. It's a phrase that's used all the time. And this was because he said, you can't just be, you can't cling on to the idea of empire. You can't just be our best friend. You've got to have a more settled place. And it was that spurred us to join the European Union. That sense that we had to, be attached to our own continent, as well as, global in our outlook. And where we are now, post-Brexit, is precisely where we were in December 1962, when Dean Acheson stood up at the West Point Military Academy and gave that speech. We had for the 40 odd years of our membership of the EU, often difficult, but we had a European pillar to our foreign policy, as well as an American pillar. And what Brexit did was it just blew up the European pillar, not just of our foreign, but of our economic policy. And it's left us in this world now, a world dominated by the US, China, and as an economic power, the European Union. And it's left us with no obvious place, no obvious way to exercise our leverage. And I'm not anti-British. I think Britain has great strengths and talents. So don't misunderstand. The book isn't pessimistic about Britain. It's pessimistic about this terrible policy decision.
And to me, I mean, and one of the things which you highlight in the book, and when you read across all the chapters, is that how long, but also how much of an effort, but then how successful it was to build the actual true special relationship with Britain had, which was with the European Union, as in contrast to the United States, with which you pretended to have a special relationship, but it was not special for the Americans. Prime Minister after Prime Minister, you built a very successful relationship with the EU, in which actually it was a la carte membership. You were within, but without. You can pick and choose. You were influential, but you were not bound. Scholars of European integration have always, been amazed by this ability to craft this relationship, to tailor-made membership to the EU in such a special way, and that's consistent through even Thatcher, of course. She understood, like every other one, that EU membership was in the national interest, right?
Yeah, absolutely.
And that you could not think of the EU as opposed, as a different thing. It was like in Spain, we also understand is that this is the other side of the coin of your national interest, your national and European interest and so on. So it's amazing how even Thatcher built that, and of course the others, and suddenly all this blew up. Why and in your reading, this very carefully crafted relationship came to an end and a halt and then collapsed.
I think the problem, I think there are two problems. One is we didn't join at the beginning. We didn't join at, we weren't there at Messina, and we weren't there at the Treaty of Rome. And it was 1970, 1973 before we joined. And, joining a club that someone had already set the rules for was pretty hard. We had sort of, we had just given up our empire. And we thought, I think, that we could sort of saunter in, and the Germans and the French and the Italians would just shift everything around to suit us. And obviously they said, no, this is our club, you sign up to the rules. I think the second problem that we had is that for most of these other nations, there was a real purpose for the European Union in terms of peace in Europe. In terms for Germany, it was legitimacy. For France, it was political leadership. For Italy, it was holding the Italian state together. And we joined because we felt we had to, because these countries were running ahead of us. And we didn't join with a purpose. We didn't join to say, okay, now, and two of our prime ministers had the chance to set that purpose. One was Thatcher and the other was Blair, and neither of them really took it. But one more thing, two conflicting emotions in our attitude towards Europe always have been. One is superiority, hubris, where we've never been invaded, we won the war, our democracy is much more deeply rooted. And the other is fear, really, that the others will gang up against us. That headlines in the Daily Mail or the Telegraph, Brussels conspiracy against, the stuff that Boris Johnson used to write, that all these people are meeting in Brussels to do us down. And our leaders never countered that. And as you say quite rightly, we scored many victories, including Mrs. Thatcher, but we didn't count them as victories.
Yeah, and then, that's I think a very telling point, that when you compare, for example, Spain and Britain, for Spain, it was a national triumph, a national success. It was a culmination of a long time standing aspiration to be recognized as member of the club. So for us, it was a high moment of the transition to democracy. Whereas in Britain, it was a recognition of a limitation. So you end up, so you start from complete different points. I remember 1986, I was 18 years old, so I came of age at the time that Spain became member. I landed in Denmark as an exchange student, and people told me that there was a democratic deficit in the European Union, and I said, no way, my country is more democratic because it's member of the European Union. You're never gonna convince me of my country being less democratic, but in Britain, you from the beginning played along, this game of the democratic deficit, the parliament, and despite the huge, benefits and the capacity to shape and influence that much more than any other, right? Or
Yeah,
at least like others.
And we did shape. I mean, if you look at Thatcher, as you said, her Bruce speech was very much about fighting within the European Union. She was very clear, don't let anyone say that we're going to go to the margins, because we're not. But, here was the inspiration for the single market. It was the Thatcher government and sending over Lord Cockfield and whatever. And then she, after the fall of the Berlin Wall, she and then John Major after her were moving forces in the enlargement of the EU. I mean, there were others, but Britain was in the forefront of this. So we could have said, as Brits, look at the success of our foreign policy. We have created or led the creation of the single market in Europe, made Europe a more open, liberal economic organization, and we've opened the doors to to the former communist states. We never claimed those victories. It's just extraordinary. But there were two opportunities, I think, missed. One was Thatcher in 1979, when, if she'd wanted to, with Giscard and Schmidt, the three of them could have got together and forged if you like, a troika of leaders who would have shaped Europe, at least for the following decades. But she decided to fight to get our money back, the great budget fight. And the other was Blair, who did forge strong relationships across Europe, including with Prime Minister Aznar in Spain. But everything was then derailed by Iraq and the special relationship. And for us, as you said earlier, it is a special relationship, and it's we can't get it out of our system. And in the end, I remember speaking to Blair about this in the run-up to the war. He said to me, "It's my duty to be on the side of the Americans." And we just haven't got that out of our system.
Yeah, that's, we always say that Article 100, which was Thatcher's legacy, is the most federalist institution that we have in the European Union because, qualified majority.
Yeah, exactly.
We never thought that Britain would need unanimity to defend her interests. That was for losers and for small countries, not for large countries, which I liked a lot. And also, as I say, Eastern enlargement as well. That's something, we would never have. I mean, not even Germany was entirely happy with it, as we know. They just wanted to get, Hungary and Poland and Czechoslovakia at the time, So one question then, because on Aznar and Blair and so on, there is this story which Aznar tells that Blair called him before he went to Parliament, thinking that he would lose the vote on Iraq and that therefore this was his last call as Prime Minister. So he asks Aznar, "How are you doing?" And he says, "Well, I just got impulse supports of 5% of the Spaniards to go to war on Iraq." And Blair says, "That's less people that think that Elvis Presley is alive." So there you have these two guys totally obsessed with a completely lost cause in which nobody believed, because they share this kind of rebalancing view also. It's not just that the Americans wanted it, it's that they wanted to turn the European Union to the Atlantic, to be more liberal and so on. So, and that was they did it for maybe in the wrong place, which was Iraq, rather than doing it in Brussels, but that was a very legitimate project. And now that we don't have Britain anymore, that kind of alternative or complementary project to the Franco-German axis is gone. So that was also very important in terms of having a marketplace of views, of ideas and so on, right?
Yeah, I think it's a problem, for the EU27, because we did play, I think, sometimes a useful, sometimes we were just very difficult and obstructive, but sometimes we also played a useful balancing role, and lots of other countries hid behind us when we were pressing, unpopular liberal causes. It's also, though, a problem of our relationship with the US now, because, if one was worried before that special became servile, at least then we had an alternative. We could turn to Europe. Now we're pulled in, and we have to we can't afford now a breach with the United States. Mm-hmm. So let me give you a small example. Just the other day, I said to someone very senior in Whitehall, "Is there any possibility that the Prime Minister will invoke Article 16 of the protocol, the Northern Ireland Protocol on Brexit?" And he said, "No." And I said, "How can you be so sure?" He just said, "Biden." Okay. I said, "What do you mean?" He said, "Well, it's been made very clear to us. If we want a good relationship with Biden, we can't do this." So, look how we've narrowed our political options.
Yeah. Then, let's move to the politics of Brexit, both at home, maybe first, and then abroad. I mean, in terms of the domestic politics of Brexit, which every one of us who, admired parliamentary democracy, the Westminster model, and, we're of course, really disappointed by the way this worked, by all these mistakes, by direct democracy, by how the parliament was even, about to be closed down in prorogation, But at the end, would you say that the whole problem here was that, as in many other instances of populism, like in the US, it is the collapse of the Conservative Party. It is the collapse of the Republican Party. I mean, we spent kind of ages discussing the end of social democracy, but there is nothing more damaging to a country than the collapse of the Conservative Party.
Right. I think that's part of it, but I think that's also, there's particular circumstances in this country. Unlike most other European countries, we've never had a long run when both parties have been pro-European. Yeah, what's happened here is, as the Conservatives have been pro-European, Labour has become anti. Labour's become pro, the Conservatives has become anti. So there's never been a sort of cross-parliament, sort of very, very solid pro-European majority. That's one thing. I think the second thing is you had the combination of the Conservatives being driven to the populist right and splitting and worried, and a Labour Party led by someone on the left who had no love of Europe, in fact was opposed to Europe, opposed to our membership of the European Union. The far right and the far left have always opposed our membership of the EU. The far left because they've said it was a capitalist club. The far right because they said it was an assault on our sovereignty. And those two things came together. But the real problem, I think, was having a referendum in the first place, because you had as we saw after the referendum, you did have overall a vaguely pro-European majority in Parliament to remain close to Europe, at least after Brexit. But you had a referendum which seemed to be pointing to a much sharper break. And you can't have, it seems to me, you've either got to accept you have a parliamentary democracy or you have a plebiscitary democracy. Yeah. The two things don't sit easily together. Yeah. And we'll find that again, I fear, with Scotland.
Or at least if you have a plebiscitary democracy, you should have had a second referendum, which is the trick about plebiscitary democracy, that you end up only voting once for dictatorship, and then that's it.
That's it, yeah. And you have these people who defend the sovereignty of Parliament. We're doing this to defend the sovereignty of Parliament, but Parliament must be prorogued, so it can't overturn. You have these contortions and distortions of the democratic system. But I think when you look at the Brexit vote here, clearly it harnessed all the populist forces that we saw elsewhere in the US and the rest of Europe, the sense of a lot of people that they've been left behind, sense that the rich and powerful were drawing down all the benefits of globalization and technology, the sense of division between big cities and smaller provincial towns. They were all there. What I think the Brexiters did rather cleverly was that they managed to channel all this into, to create a single enemy. And that was this sort of, Europe became globalization, became immigration, became, losing your job, became everything. And that's what happens with referendums. You can channel the discontents. I think there were not 52% of people who were, thinking, we've got to get out of Europe. In fact, on the month that Cameron announced that he was going to have a referendum, Europe was ninth on the list of concerns of British people. After health, education, all these other things first.
And then on Labour Party, like socialists in Spain and progressives, what is quite amazing is that it took so long, or they didn't see the fact that under any circumstances. I mean, you could understand the project of the Conservatives to have Singapore in the Atlantic, you know, with financial services, but there was no way British workers would be better off under these scenarios which the Conservative wanted for Brexit, because, you know, if you want to compete globally in this kind of global Britain, you know, you of course are going to do it on lowest salaries and on financial services, not on workers' rights and so on. You know, how did it take so long for the Labour Party to realize this, or have they realized at all of this?
Well, I think there are two things. One, there's a section of the left, the Corbynite left, for which it's all ideological, and they have in their mind, you know, this is a conspiracy of capitalists to do down working people, and it's quite difficult to get beyond that. In the poorer parts of the rest of England, though, the so-called Red Wall that the Tories have now won, but UKIP, the United Kingdom Independence Party, built a lot of support for Brexit. You know, Labour MPs saw UKIP and the Tories doing what Trump did in America, and using cultural issues to drive a wedge between them and parties of the left. So, you know, Brexit became, you know, it was a cultural issue. It was about immigration. It was about stopping these people from Romania or from Turkey, as you know, the lie that was told was that Turkey was about to join the EU. So, and it was a demonstration about how you can use cultural and identity issues to undercut the economic argument that the left would have. And to your point too about the Conservative vision, there was never a Conservative vision of the post-Brexit world, because some of them wanted, as you say, the free market, you know, Singapore on the edge of Europe. But a lot of these other people that representing these poorer areas wanted basically to throw up the barricades and say, we want to only eat things and make things and use things that are made in Britain. So they were conflicting, and that was hidden during the campaign.
And one of the things you deal with also, of course, you know, when on the Brexit negotiations with the EU, is that you have this paradox that what everyone thought was the best diplomatic service in Europe, you know, admired by everyone because the capacity to craft, you know, all these negotiations and agreements, completely failed to defend something because, you know, there were so many contradictions in terms and policy was totally nonsensical that, you know, you could not have even the best diplomats making nothing substantive out of that, right?
Well, I think the policy of the then Prime Minister, David Cameron, was about as inept and misguided as any Prime Minister could. Having called the referendum, you might have expected him to run a good, strong campaign to actually win it. In fact, he led an extremely poor campaign, which was based purely on the economics and had no sense of, you know, the sort of bigger question about what we could and were gaining from Europe. It also focused on, you know, when his so-called renegotiation of our terms focused on protecting the City of London. Now, you know, all those people in the north of England were not going to vote to stay in the EU because David Cameron had got a good agreement to help the bankers down in London. It was completely crazy. But, you know, this was David Cameron's legacy. I'll tell you a story that defines David Cameron. It was soon after he became Prime Minister, I was having lunch with someone who worked for him in Number 10. And I was just asking him about this new Prime Minister. What's he like? You know, how does he work? There were no great secrets being exchanged at this lunch. It was just right. You know, how does it feel to work with him? Does he work hard? And then I said to him, what does David Cameron think about the world? And the civil servant looked at me and said, and this is just something out of Yes Minister, if anyone's watched this, he said, I think the Prime Minister thinks the world is somewhere where you go on a holiday. I think that's I thought at the time I thought that was too cruel. But as time passed, that basically summarized David Cameron's grasp of foreign and European policy.
Okay, because we have just a few more minutes for just maybe two questions. One is, or maybe it's the same question too. What next abroad? I mean, yes, we've seen now Britain marginalized on these discussions now on China, Russia. You know, it's a pity because, you know, on Russia, of course, Britain was always at the forefront, and you know, I really miss Britain on the visit by Borrell to Lavrov, you know, to have more muscle, you know, and so on, you know. So what next for Britain? I mean, is there any way to reconstruct something like a meaningful role with the EU, at least in foreign security policy, which is the strength that the UK, even if from without, always brought to the table?
Not yet is the answer. I think we're going to see with this government and with this group of MPs, we're going to see a very difficult, scratchy period with in relations with the EU, because as Brexit doesn't show the rewards that were promised, who's going to get the blame? You can see it already in some of the tabloid press and among Tory MPs. It's all the faults. They're trying to punish us. They're being vindictive, you know. So and we'll see in the short term, because Britain now, you know, chairs the G7 and is hosting the climate conference in the autumn. You know, there'll be a lot of we're playing on the global stage. This is global Britain. So it's going to take a while, I think. But my sense will be that, you know, look 3, 4, 5 years down the road, when Britain in the 2020s is going to look a bit like Britain in the 1960s, falling behind again. You know, everything, you know, being, you know, just not quite as good as the German or the Spanish or the Italian or the French. And fear will reemerge as the sort of dominant emotion. Look, we can't let ourselves be, you know, left behind again. So I think we will. I think, you know, we can't abolish our geography or our history or our economic ties. They'll all pull us back, but not with this group, not with this government and this group of MPs.
And then last question then is, at home, do you think Britain will survive Brexit? I mean, the mounting question of both Scotland, you mentioned that in the book as well, you know, Northern Ireland, maybe, you know, because there's such a vested interest by everyone in keeping the situation calm, but you know, to which extent can the situation in Scotland hold 4 years, or for how long can it hold?
Well, I think this will depend on what happens in terms of the, you know, I think it's going to be very hard. I mean, we see now that the SNP, as nationalists in Scotland, have their own political problems, the fighting between the present and past leadership. And so, you know, that may make things difficult for the nationalists in the short term. My view, though, is that if over time, the Scots are moving pretty clearly towards independence. If you look at young people, they're much more pro-independence than older people. They were more pro-European. And of course, Scotland voted very heavily to remain in the EU. So if I took a 10-year view, I would say the likelihood is that Scotland will become independent. What I hope, because I'm a unionist and I hope it doesn't become independent, is that within that period, England will begin to see sense and will be trying to rebuild, you know, if not rejoin the EU, build the sort of political security and new economic relationships with Europe. So Scotland won't see, at the moment, if you're Scots, you're faced with a choice which can be presented as, You can either be pro-European or you can be tied to England. And the Scots need a choice that says you can be pro-European and tied to England. Now, if that first choice remains, then Scotland will become independent. So, I'm very nervous about, and if, I'm hoping that there isn't an early referendum and that there is time for England to rethink its relationship with Europe.
Okay, so I think there are a number of questions in the chat. So I will thanks for this conversation. It was amazing, and I'll turn it over to Justine and Jimmy.
Great. Thanks for the questions and the thoughts.
People in the chat with the questions.
Thank you very much, both of you. We're going to come back to you, obviously. There are quite a few questions, and I've been looking at them as they've come in. Some of them, I think, have been addressed quite spontaneously in your conversation, so I won't go in particular order. But I wanted to sort of, Philip, probably return the conversation to the economics and historic side. There's a question from Matt Chamberlain from the London Metal Exchange, saying, really interesting discussion, many thanks. My question, historically, Britain's attempts to go it alone seem often to have been ended by external economic pressure, and also often with pressure from the US, Bretton Woods, Ike holding back the IMF loan over Suez, the West Point speech. Does the Brexit experiment end the same way? Will we be forced back into Europe by similar events?
I'd hesitate to say, I think the analysis is absolutely right. If you look at Britain's retreat from the world and map it against sterling crises in the post-war period, you get an almost perfect fit. And it's not just Ike and Suez, it's the devaluation of '67 and the retreat from east of Suez in the early '70s, and the rest. The tension has been in our global aspirations and our straitened economic circumstance, and that's generally shown through in sterling crises. Now, whether the next economic crisis will show through as a sterling crisis, I don't know. But it seems to me that if we go back to this rhythm in which Britain consistently, in terms of productivity and growth, lags behind its principal European neighbours and competitors, that is going to bring about the reassessment I was just talking about, where people say, okay, we may not like the European Union, or we may object to all this, but from a self-interested point of view, we've got to get along with it and we've got to re-engage. Now, I'm not talking about rejoining, but in terms of re-engaging in terms of whether it's Norwegian or Swiss or other forms. And equally for security, as José Ignacio said, we're completely now locked out of security arrangements for Europe. We don't have a role in discussions about sanctions against Russia, even though we are one of the sort of victims of Putin's revisionism. We don't have a role in dealing with the migrants coming over the Mediterranean, many of whom want to come, of course, to Britain. We're locked out of all these discussions. We're locked out of discussions about anti-terrorism in Europe. Now, how long, I think, before people say, when we get over the shock of Brexit and we get a new set of politicians, before people say, we've got to leave that behind us and start dealing with Europe on a pragmatic, sensible basis, which represents our interests as a nation, not our emotions.
Thank you, Philip. a couple of questions, or 2-3 questions, which cover the same ground, and I'll try to the extent that I can kind of submerge both of them into one. But Dame Denise Holt and my colleague on the board, Justice Ellis, sort of looking at the, whether the whole concept of an ever deepening relationship that was dreamed about between the Britain and Europe was really just complete fantasy land, and the question was not whether it was going to happen, but when. I mean, Justin sort of develops that and says, was the UK's heart ever really in Europe? We didn't join Schengen, and we always had opt-outs on major policies such as EMU, security, Charter of Fundamental Rights. Isn't everyone better off with us out of the club if we're not going to play by its rules? Ignacio? Do
you want me to
yeah.
respond?
And Nacho, can you take that up, and then Philip?
Ignacio, you're on mute.
Yeah, sorry, the connection was broken in the last sentence. Could you just please reformulate the question? Yes. Sorry.
Okay, just to pick up on Justin, was the UK's heart ever really in Europe? We didn't join Schengen. We always had opt-outs on major policies such as EMU, security, Charter of Fundamental Rights. Isn't everybody better off with us out of the club if we're not going to play by its rules?
I mean, honestly, I'm not against those who rejoice by the damage done by Brexit. At the beginning, there was this kind of sentiment of continental Europe in some countries, in France and so on, that we're better off. We will be better off without the Brits. Look at Spain, for example. Spain and Britain were the two countries who truly believed in the single market. The Spanish companies could only buy companies in Britain, airports, utilities. We could not do that in France and in Germany. Just a very late point and so on. Also because of the exchanges. I don't think, and of course, in any issue, you could see that Britain was a bit of a hassle, but I think the overall deal was
getting a bit of interference there. I don't know if
I don't know if whether it's me or
yeah. Philip, can you come in if you've got any comment on this, because otherwise I'll move on to another question.
Yeah, very quickly. I think, look, Britain was semi-detached. We all know that, and that created awkwardnesses and obstructions. But I think that we were in the single market, in the customs union, and in political cooperation sufficiently to make us a worthwhile partner for most of the other states, and for us to derive significant leverage in promoting our own interests. I think the future of the EU 27 anyway is of looser groupings of nations. We're not going to have 27 marching as one. That's been clear for some years now. So I think Britain, in some associate membership linkage, could have certainly remained and could rejoin or could re-participate in European policy making. I don't think that's a problem. I don't think, you may have a very hard core of Eurozone countries, but I don't think that would exclude a British role. And I think even now, most other European countries would prefer that we were in than out.
Thank you, Philip. Roger Gordon has a question. Also a member of the board, former civil servant. Where do you predict Johnson's Global Britain is going to demonstrate its promised buccaneering vigor? With our carrier group or with our soft power? Philip?
Well, it should be with our soft power, but sadly, we're going to send off our carrier group to the Indian Ocean and the South China Sea to show, in this sort of macho way, that we can still rule the waves. Of course, some people will point out that we can't afford enough planes to put on the carrier. So when it sails the South China Sea, it will have a flight of US Marine planes on board to sort of bulk up the British numbers. But sadly, we've invested in these emblems of power, when what we should be doing is using our soft power, and we have lots of it. And in terms of military capabilities, we should have been building our capabilities in terms of, naval capabilities that can be useful, not great ships with expensive planes, which can't, are never going to fight wars and will never be particularly useful.
Juan Reg, another trustee, has a question. To what extent can Britain capitalize better than the EU the emergence of Asia, particularly China, as a superpower?
I find it rather difficult to see how it can at all, because we experimented only 4 or 5 years ago with being China's best friend in the West. This was David Cameron and George Osborne's policy. That lasted, I think, 4 or 5 years. It's now certainly gone because the present government, and I think rightly so, wants to stand on its principles as far as Hong Kong is concerned. And China itself has changed direction. China has, basically repudiated any idea of signing up for a, rules-based system as a reliable partner. And you look at what's happening internally to the Uyghur in China. It's going to be very difficult for the US to deal with China. It's going to be very difficult for the EU to deal with China. How is Little Britain going to have an independent role in dealing with Beijing?
That takes one to a related question, which is back to the special relationship, we can still call that, from Amy Bell, a member also of the FT. How do you see Britain's special relationship with the US developing under Biden?
Well, look, I don't think Biden is going to particularly hold it against the Prime Minister, that the Prime Minister's was extremely rude about him and about President Obama, although it doesn't help. And it doesn't help that some of the officials now working for Biden were there with President Obama when the Prime Minister made some very unfortunate comments about, President Obama's Kenyan heritage, for example. Those sorts of comments are recalled, but I think Biden is a sensible politician. America will treat with Britain as it always has. If we're a reliable ally that will do things that America finds useful, they will stick with us. If we decide to head off in another direction, they will drop us. And their starting point, as I suppose as we saw at the Munich Security Conference the other day, when Biden, Macron and Merkel appeared together, and the Prime Minister appeared a couple of hours later on his own, the starting point from the Americans now is going to be talking to the Germans and the French.
One for Nacho, probably, actually, from Alec Morrow. To what extent does the lack of the need for a second language in the UK make it difficult for the UK to understand Europe and the EU?
Well, we destroy English so well that it's now a second language, which sometimes British people cannot understand, even in council meetings and so on. So, but it's become universal, and there is very little to do about it. I mean, I think the alternatives are much worse in any case, so. But I don't feel that British people have less of an understanding of issues in Europe than people in other countries, really. I mean, I think people is not generally educated on EU affairs, even at the higher levels of government, as Philip has realized. Even the best education in Eton doesn't buy you an understanding of how the EU works, and then you want to be in the customs union, but at the same time don't have a border. I mean, so yeah.
an interesting one from Nigel Aston, who's a Brit living in Spain, but brings up the subject of the Commonwealth, which I don't think has come up much in conversation. But his question is, isn't part of the problem the Commonwealth? The loss of an empire, nevertheless, found a substitute via Gaitskell's 1,000 Years of History speech. And one of the Brexiteer arguments that somehow the UK has an alternative, inverted commas, common market, end inverted commas. Philip.
Well, I mean, this was one of the arguments, but it was one of the many arguments made by the Brexiteers that, as I just said, is without foundation. We have to have, if we want to deal and trade with Commonwealth countries, we have to do trade deals with them. The idea that we're going to do a trade deal with India, I find, the last big trade deal India did was, I don't know, a decade ago or more. We don't have any special access into the Commonwealth. We never really have. But it's always been an argument on the right that, somehow we could gather up our Commonwealth friends. Now, the other thing that's said is that we perhaps could reactivate the Anglosphere. We can gather up, the US, Australia, New Zealand, and Canada into one grouping. And there is certainly an intelligence grouping, the Five Eyes, between those countries. But the US isn't going to set its policy on a sort of five-nation, basis. The US will set its policy and gather people around it, whether they're in the Five Eyes or not. And if the French or Germans are willing to sign up to a policy, they're not going to be excluded by the Americans. So this idea that we can have our own little exclusive clubs, I think is beyond risible, really.
We're reaching the sort of the end of our session, but just looking at the sort of remaining questions, I think that they basically bunch into two groups, which again I'm going to try and merge, and I hope I do justice to the people who've bothered to raise them. But I mean, basically, the first one, which I think I'll take first, has to do with that dreaded C word, which we haven't used this evening, which is COVID, and the interrelationship between COVID and Brexit and the political situation and how it's playing out. Marina Peridarcos has raised this. There are other people who've raised it, but it's that there is one particular. I think probably it's summarized best by Julia, who asked the question, during the pandemic, there's been many references by Boris Johnson and Matt Hancock to the Blitz spirit and World War II in general. Why is that? And do you think it has affected the handling of the pandemic? I mean, can you address that, Philip?
Well, I mean, the Prime Minister sadly never ceases to refer to the Second World War and the Blitz spirit, and also sometimes rather unkindly and stupidly about the position of other countries in the Second World War. This is sort of silliness. I mean, basically, we've done incredibly well in terms of the vaccination program in the last few months, and those of us who are critics of the government should admit, would not admit, should be, singing from the rooftops that this bit we've got really right, it seems. We got quite a lot wrong last year, but it does show, it points to an area of science and the NHS where we can actually do rather well. I think it's not the Blitz spirit that's made the vaccination go well. It's rather the harnessing of local people and local volunteers and local agencies and organizations, doctors and clinics and whatever. And after trying last year with, these sort of companies running track and trace from sort of warehouses with, with apps, the government has reverted to a sense of doing things locally, and that has worked. But it's made some good decisions about vaccines, and it's done very well. But I don't think in the great scheme of things, this is going to affect our relationship, over the next year, in future years. I mean, this is something for this year. It's something for us to be proud about in Britain at the moment, not to boast about, not like our press to be doing, yah boo, aren't we doing well, you're doing badly, which is what you get in some of our media. It's good that we can show from time to time that as Brits that we can do some things well.
The second bunch of questions, which I think we're going to end up on, is just winding up on refocusing on UK-Spanish relations and the future of it coming out of all this. Dr. Caroline Gray from Aston University has a specific question for Nacho. You mentioned the admiration in Spain and beyond for the Westminster model of parliamentary democracy and how that has been tarnished to some degree by use of direct democracy. To what extent do you think Brexit has damaged the long-standing admiration of UK democracy among much of the Spanish political class?
Well, I mean, it has, certainly, because, when we always admire the institutions, but also the traditions and the norms and the soft norms of British parliamentarism and so on. But this is to say, that our political class hasn't done any better. So it's just the feeling is that representative democracy is in crisis all over the place, and you don't get the best results anywhere. So, but yes, I mean, there is a mirror that you wanted to look in and see things which you don't see anymore in Britain, and that's gone for a while, also in the United States.
And then sort of just finally, basically this is probably for both of you, but I think probably putting the ball back into Philip's bat. Ben Welch, what particular areas of cooperation, political, economic, strategic, is this for London and Madrid as the UK, as Ben puts it, swishes off to liberty and the charms of the deep blue sea? Philip.
Well, I mean, we have to make sure, first of all, that the new arrangements for Gibraltar work and work properly. But secondly, clearly, if Britain's decided that it's not going to have institutional relationships with the EU in terms of some of these big issues, which are common security problems for all of us. So whether it's the Mediterranean, security in the Mediterranean, whether it's terrorism, in North Africa and below, whether it's dealing with international crime, or migration, all these issues, if we're not going to do them with the EU, then we have to build strong relationships with strong countries like Spain to try and cooperate. Now, the French have proposed one or two mechanisms for security cooperation, which can include groups of countries from outside, as well as groups of countries from inside the EU. And that's where I would see the possibility of Spain and Britain coming together, as it were, to work together with like-minded nations within the EU, but not on EU 27, but groups of nations.
Nacho, have you got any quick comments on that?
Yeah, very briefly, because on Gibraltar, I think they gained the admiration of Spaniards by seeing 96% of them voting Remain. People probably didn't think that they were so, common sense was, it was so widespread in Gibraltar because of all these tensions and so on. And also, as Philip said, the agreement which is being crafted around Gibraltar, it's fantastic in terms of showing how far can you go despite all these constraints of sovereignty, when there is the political will to do so. So, you know, we're twisting laws and concepts in such an amazing way in Gibraltar, about which a former colony of a country which is no longer a member of the European Union is now in Schengen. You know? And that, you know, this is what British diplomats were amazing at for years, you know, and you have this micro control experiment that, you know, if you start thinking and talking about sovereignty, a lot of good things can happen. You know?
Brilliant point. Brilliant.
Thank you very much, both of you. I think I'll wind up. I mean, just reflecting on everything I've been hearing. I mean, I as a sort of Anglo-Spaniard, British citizen, born in Madrid, but I've always and a boy of the 60s, really, or that was born in the 50s. I've always thought that the two things Britain, no one does it better, really. One is James Bond, and the other one is the Beatles. So there's some hope in that, both in terms of music and also the excellence of our intelligence services. But I just wanted to end on a qualification or correction from one of our questionnaires, Nigel Aston, who early on I described as a Brit living in Spain. He wants to point out that as from last month, I am a Spaniard living in Spain. So I'll leave that as a thought to ponder on. I hope this doesn't mean to lead to a complete kind of hemorrhaging of Brits becoming Spaniards or Spaniards becoming Brits, but that we can go on engaging as two people with a lot to learn from each other. Thank you very much, you two. It's been absolutely absorbing. And Philip, just listening to you in particular, my God, I miss the FT. You know, our little walks up and down the corridors and our gossip, but we'll catch up when COVID is over. Okay, mate. Thank you very much, Nacho.
Thank you very much.
Thank you all to all of you. And just to remind you that, you know, our webinar series will continue. There is actually two members of ours talking about a wonderful new book on Madrid, Midnight City, on the 15th of March, which our friends, the Cervantes Institute, will host. Then there will be later on in the month an engagement with our scholars, the postgraduate scholarships, which Ben Welch is organizing. And just to flag up, we are obviously following the roadmap very, very carefully to the extent one can figure out what's going to be happening. But we are hopeful of opening up to live events, and we'll certainly keep you posted on that. Live events both in the UK, in London, and in Spain. So please keep looking at our website. We'll obviously keep you informed. Thank you very much, both of you and all our attendees. Thanks very much. And thank you, Justin, for hosting it brilliantly and stopping the interference from Moscow. Thanks very much.
Thanks. Bye.
Bye-bye, everyone.
Bye, everyone.
See you soon in Malaga, I hope.
Soon, I hope.